Hi everyone, welcome to the Yissilmissil Productions channel. My name is Yissil, and today we are on part 11 of our deep dive series into the Chicago film industry, and we will be reading from chapter 11 today. We have one chapter to do today, and that will be that. But it's more Chaplin, and we will be getting through that. It's been a long day for me, and in a good way, it was a long day. So chapter 11 is Chaplin in Chicago, his new job. Chapter 11, Chaplin in Chicago, his new job. Despite his best attempts to put on a brave face, Charlie Chaplin was miserable with Essanay by the time he commenced work for the studio on his first picture, fittingly titled His New Job. When he asked to see the rushes at the end of the day, Essanay screened the original camera negative to save itself the expense of making a print. Chaplin was mortified. Chaplin traced most of the studio's troubles back to one source, Thomas Edison, who had attempted to monopolize the industry through his motion picture patents company. And Essanay was, as Chaplin wrote, quote, smug and self-satisfied. Having been one of the first to enter the film business and being protected by patent rights that gave him a monopoly, their last consideration was the making of good pictures. And although other companies were challenging their patent rights and making better films, Essanay still went smugly on, dealing out scenarios like playing cards every Monday morning. End quote. Chaplin was distressed by the inner workings of the studio, which he found to be grim and businesslike, a far cry from the happy atmosphere Louella Parsons would later describe. He said that the staff were, quote, stuffy and went around like bank clerks. The business end of it was very impressive, but not their films. The different departments were partitioned like tellers' cages. It was anything but conductive to creative work, end quote. Certainly, it was quite a change from the genial Keystone, which Joyce Milton described as having the atmosphere of a slightly disreputable summer camp. The grim atmosphere Chaplin found may have been simply a reaction against the company's recent discovery that its business was in trouble, largely because it had not been careful enough in the previous years. The Essanay at which Chaplin arrived was trying to get its act together. When he arrived, he was directed to the front desk so that Louella Parsons could give him a script. This instruction was merely an example of the studio trying to be responsible, but Chaplin was furious. Quote, I don't use other people's scripts, I write my own, end quote, Chaplin said curtly. Parsons, in fact, was a bit distressed by the signing of Chaplin, knowing full well that Essanay could not really afford him, and that, As the head of the scenario department, she had taken the brunt of the responsibility for the dire financial state of the company. Indeed, the same month Chaplin arrived, Parsons left, robbing the studio of its most esteemed screenwriter. Chaplin wandered about the studio all day, miserably wondering what he should be doing and why nothing was being done for him after all the trouble they had gone to bring him there in the first place. He also wondered where his bonus check was. The next morning, Chaplin requested a cast and was given one, including Ben Turpin, who Chaplin liked instantly. When looking for a leading lady, Chaplin immediately picked out a young Gloria Swanson. In Tramp, her Chaplin biography, Joyce Milton suggests that this was not a case of Chaplin's recognizing star quality in Swanson, but Chaplin trying to integrate himself with his hostess, Molly Anderson, who employed Gloria's cigarette-smoking Aunt Igna as a nanny. Chaplin was, however, by no means concerned with integrating himself to anyone at Essanay. He was clearly concerned with making the best picture he could. It is doubtful that he would have picked her had he not seen a leading lady in Swanson. Chaplin spent a full day working up routines with his future screen legend. In a still photo that survives today, Swanson looks less like a proverbial deer caught in headlights than like a deer that has actually been hit by a truck. She recalled, quote, "These routines all involved kicking each other in the pants, running into things, and falling over each other. He reminded me of a pixie from some other world altogether. I felt like a cow trying to dance with a toy poodle." Unquote. She haughtily told Chaplin that she did not see what was funny about any of these routines. Her comment hurt him more than he let on. When Chaplin finally began work on his new job, a movie about a stagehand brought into cover for an unpunctual star, Swanson was downgraded to a bit part as a stenographer. Another actress was given the lead. The lesson did Swanson some good, however. She would do a Chaplin impersonation in Manhandled in 1923, and again in her famous role in Sunset Boulevard in 1950. Francis X. Bushman was not terribly amused by his new job either. He felt that the, quote, unpunctual star, end quote, was a caricature of him. Still, seeing that Chaplin was unhappy with Essanay, Bushman tried to reassure him. He said, quote, "Whatever you think of the studio, it is just the antithesis." End quote. Chaplin said, quote, "I don't like the studio, and I don't like the word antithesis." End quote. He had barely been in the studio for 3 days when a reporter for Picture Play Weekly arrived. Chaplin was not yet used to reporters. Few of them had made the journey out to Los Angeles. He told her when she said she had enjoyed his vaudeville appearances in Chicago, quote, "I'm afraid. You are trying to put me in good humor for the interview, and really you haven't a chance to succeed." End quote. As he said this, someone who thought the room was too warm opened a window to the January air. Chaplin immediately, quote, did one of those funny little turn up the nose and look to the side tricks, end quote. Then moved his chair closer to the steam pipe. He had already decided that he would not be in Chicago for long. Quote, "And to think I was in California last week," end quote, he moaned, eliciting a laugh. Quote, "Bronco Billy did this. If it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be freezing. I'll have to stand it a while longer. Then it's back to the west for mine." End quote. The reporter quickly noted that this performance was all for laughs, not based on any real anger at Anderson. Everyone present had a good chuckle, though it was not, in fact, entirely a joke. And Chaplin, perhaps still smarting from Swanson's critique, went on to tell the reporter that he really aspired to more dramatic roles. If Chaplin's appearance at the College Inn had failed to warrant a mention in the Chicago Daily Tribune, his presence at Essanay did the trick. He had been there for barely a week when the Daily Tribune's pseudonymously and splendidly named movie writer May Tints, or Matinee, or Matinee, Maettinee, so it's a name, but it's supposed to say matinee, came to conduct the interview. By this time, Chaplin was already hiding out, making himself scarce and wanting for sport to arrive. The guide who met Tenay at the front desk had no idea where he was. He said, quote, "You may not believe him, but he is scared to death of publicity, and I had my hands full, I can tell you, to pry permission out of him for this interview." End quote. They looked all over the studio without success before trying the projection room, where Tenay hoped that even if Chaplin was not there, maybe she could meet Anderson or Bushman. The projection room consisted of 2 rows of schoolroom-style seats with desks attached facing the screen. There they found Bushman seated at one desk and Anderson, freshly back from California, in another. His oversized cowboy physique dwarfed the tiny chair. A handful of other people, clerks, and crew sat at other desks. Over in the corner sat Chaplin. The guide sat Tenay down and told her to sit there until the picture Anderson's newest Win, Love, and Honor called was over. He said, quote, "I'll guard the door and see that Mr. Chaplin doesn't get out." Tenay assured her readers that Anderson was all that they dreamed he would be. She wrote, quote, "Believe me, girls, Mr. Anderson in the flesh is some winner," end quote. All through the screening, though, Anderson looked, she wrote, as if he wished he were any place but there. Chaplin, too, clearly was not in the mood to be interviewed. He was still dismayed at the way things were going, and only the brusque arm of Tenay's guide stopped him from bolting from the room the minute the screening ended. Tenay said, "Mr. Chaplin, I guess there's no use denying it." I'm sorry. Tenay said, "Mr. Chaplin, ? And Chaplin said, quote, "I guess there's no use denying it. Glad to meet you." End quote. As the guide led them upstairs to an office, Tenay asked why he did not like to be interviewed. Quote, "Don't you know it's good for you?" End quote, she asked. Chaplin said, quote, "I doubt it. You see, people aren't strong for celebrities that are already made. When a man's been boosted to the skies, they're apt to sit back in their seats and say, 'I don't see anything so wonderful about that chap. He's overrated.' But if the man is not made, they take pride and joy in discovering him." End quote. By this time, Chaplin had been writing and directing his own films for 9 months, an eternity in the film business. Quote, "I think I'm going to like it here." End quote, he said politely. Quote, "Nice people, nice studio. I'll miss California and the old Keystone bunch, though." End quote. Tenay said as Chaplin sighed, quote, "Your audience will follow you. That will delight your soul, and your correspondents will write to you." End quote. Now Chaplin grinned. Quote, "You bet they will," end quote, he said, and his smile broke into a laugh as he told Essanay about the first fan letter he had ever received from a boy who used the word favorite, favorite, quote unquote, about 6 times, quote unquote, and who ended his letter by saying, quote, "You was certainly grand, Mr. Chaplin, all through THREW, the Pixter, Pixter. But the way you squirted water, WATTER, out of your mouth was classic," end quote. Though Essanay noted that Chaplin seemed relieved to be pulled back to work, she was duly charmed by him, or at least claimed to be. Quote, "He's a nice as well as a funny Charlie Chaplin," end quote, she wrote. Quote, "25 and unmarried girls," end quote. To Motion Picture Magazine, he granted a somewhat lengthier interview expounding about his life story, which he embellished a bit, and his method of work. Chaplin created the impression that, goofy as he was on camera, he had become very serious about his craft in a way that few other motion picture actors had been. He said, quote, "Motion picture comedy is still in its infancy. In the next few years, I expect to see so many improvements that you could then scarcely recognize the comedy of the present day," end quote. He did not say that he was pretty sure that those improvements would not be coming from Essanay, but he was. He had already decided that his new job would be his only Chicago movie. Chaplin never seems to have bothered to find a permanent address in the city. While rumors persist that he lived in a penthouse in the Brewster Apartments in Lincoln Park, a building that still stands at 2800 North Pine Grove Avenue today, this is likely nothing more than an urban legend. The books that claim Chaplin resided there fail to cite sources, and the Brewster Apartments are located about 3.5 miles north of the former Essanay complex, in contrast to Bronco Billy's apartment, which was mere blocks away. Given the short amount of time he was in Chicago and his notorious thriftiness, it is more probable that Chaplin bunked with the Andersons for the entirety of his 3-week stay. Though he wrote of living in, quote, "sumptuous style," end quote, while working for Keystone, those who knew him in Chicago saw no evidence of it. Hazel Budenmeyer, Buddemeyer, who worked as a negative cutter, later remembered that she and her co-workers thought that their own salary, $18 per week, was fantastic. The studio employees, actors, and crew alike would take turns taking spins in one another's cars and dine in high fashion at the stylish Green Mill. Budmeyer recalled, quote, "We all took turns buying drinks except Charlie. When his turn came, we would hide down at the end of the bar. He was the stingiest man I ever saw," end quote. In 1969, William Grisham asked Molly Anderson, quote, Bronco Billy's widow, on what in the world Chaplin spent his money, and she also remembered him as a skinflint. She said, "Well, he didn't exactly throw his money away. Charlie has the first nickel he ever earned. I'm certain of that," end quote. Orson Welles, who was born in Wisconsin during Chaplin's tenure at Essanay, and would later provide the story idea for Chaplin's Monsieur Verdot, from 1947, referred to Chaplin as the, quote, cheapest man who ever lived, end quote. Indeed, when it eventually came time for Chaplin to build his own house in Hollywood, he saved money by using studio carpenters. These men were used to building temporary sets. Visitors to Chaplin's house were stunned to find doorknobs and railings coming off in their hands. Chaplin himself was already joking about his stinginess in 1915. He told Motion Picture Magazine that when he first got off the train in Chicago, a newsboy had seen him and shouted to his friend, quote, "What do you think of that ham fat? $100,000 a year, and he looks like a tramp," end quote. Chaplin was almost finished with his new job when, after 2 weeks, Spoor finally arrived. Chaplin wasted no time in confronting him about his promised bonus. Spoor hemmed and hawed, saying it was not really his department and that he had not seen the contract, but he was sure that the front desk would take care of it all. Chaplin was positively enraged. He asked, quote, "What are you scared of? You can still get out of your contract if you wish. In fact, I think you've already broken it," end quote. Spoor said softly, quote, "We'll take care of the matter right now," end quote. Naturally, when he retold the story, Spoor told it differently and made a crack of his own about Chaplin's legendary cheapness. He told the Daily News, quote, "Came the day I was to meet the man whom I was paying $1,250 a week, and there stood a little chap in the Chicago winter cold without an overcoat. I gave him his first week's pay and a bonus of 1 week's pay, which he demanded for signing. He tucked $2,500 into his pocket, and I sent him downtown with an advertising man to buy a coat. I couldn't believe it when I saw it. An oversized, ragged coat with no belt and just one button that kind of camped over Charlie. It was the most misfit coat I ever saw. So I called in the advertising man and asked him if Charlie was pulling a gag on me. The answer was no. The man said, quote, I took him to Willoughby and Hill, Mr. Spoor, but every coat was too expensive. He bought a coat at a second-hand place on Clark Street for $2. That was Charlie Chaplin," end quote. Spoor did see to it that the check was cut and did whatever he could to make Chaplin happy, but the two never quite warmed up to one another. Chaplin was not adjusting to Chicago. He missed California. Spoor offered to send him to the Western Studio in Niles, California, where Anderson was still doing most of his work. Anderson had told Chaplin that the Chicago studio was better suited to comedy, but Chaplin had just told the Daily Tribune that, quote, with conditions favorable, a man can do so much better work, you know, end quote. He also liked Anderson better than Spoor. Hence, Chaplin left Chicago for Niles as soon as his new job was completed. Essanay's public relations department, as well as the Los Angeles Times, said that Chaplin blamed the cold. In fact, though he certainly was not enthusiastic about Chicago's weather, he blamed Spoor. Chaplin's entire Chicago residency lasted just 23 days. When his new job was released on February 1st, 1915, he was already in Niles, California, never to look back. It is extremely impressive that the 25-year-old Chaplin could write, direct, and star in a film, even a two-reeler, in less than 2 weeks' time, using Chicago facilities and collaborators with whom he had previously been completely unfamiliar. One of the reasons Chaplin was able to work so quickly and efficiently in Chicago was his ingenious idea to make, quote, his new job a, quote, meta-film, end quote. The movie begins with Chaplin's familiar little tramp character showing up to audition for a part in a movie at Lodestone Studios, an obvious reference to former employer Keystone. The interior stages, as well as the employees of Essanay, essentially play themselves as Lodestone, which saved Essanay the expense of having to design and construct new sets and costumes, but also had the benefit of giving audiences a fascinating documentary-like peek into the process of movie making in 1915. The slim plot in His New Job centers on the tramp getting a job first as a production assistant, then as a carpenter, and finally as an extra in what appears to be a prestigious period film set in 19th century Russia. Of course, he wreaks havoc on the set, and the entire production soon dissolves into a state of slapstick anarchy. Interestingly, advertisements for His New Job played up the film's self-reflexive aspect. Although the title obviously alluded to the beginning of a new phase in Chaplin's career, the ads also billed Chaplin and co-star Ben Turpin as playing themselves. His New Job opened to positive reviews both locally and across the nation, some of which attempted to contextualize it with Chaplin's budding filmography. In her Daily Tribune review, Kitty Kelly noted that Chaplin's persona seemed a little nicer than he had been in his Keystone films, while also claiming, quote, "It is hard to conceive of him being any funnier," end quote. If His New Job remains one of the high points of Chaplin's Essanay output, that is likely because it was made before his problems with Spohr and Anderson had become irreversible. Although Chaplin never truly felt at home at Essanay, he also admitted that Spohr and Anderson initially gave him carte blanche to do what he wanted. This freedom allowed Chaplin to try new things, in particular the blending of comedy and pathos that would become the hallmark of his mature masterpieces of the 1920s and 1930s. Various sources claim Chaplin co-wrote His New Job with Luella Parsons, but as with Chaplin's Keystone comedies, the film was most likely improvised, as the inclusion of a behind-the-scenes game of dice between the tramp and a member of the crew suggests. The dice game was apparently inspired by the real-life dice games played by Essanay cast and crew members while taking lunch breaks at Al Sternberg's bar and restaurant on the corner of Broadway and Argyle Streets, just a few blocks away. This was an old Essanay custom that had apparently not fallen by the wayside given the company's financial woes. Since the loser had to pay the bill, one can only assume the notoriously thrifty Chaplin excelled at dice. Indeed, he wrote in his autobiography that he had had ample time to practice this skill in his vaudeville days. He wrote, quote, "In those days, the Middle West had charm. The atmosphere was romantic. Every drugstore and saloon had a dice-throwing desk in the entrance where one gambled for whatever products they sold. On Sunday morning, Main Street was a continual hollow sound of rattling dice, which was pleasant and friendly, and many a time I won $1's worth of goods for 10 cents. Although His New Job is still quite funny by modern standards, its most interesting aspect today is probably the dramatic moment in the film where it's film within the film, and when Tramp tearfully pleads for the leading lady not to leave him before accidentally ripping her dress and using the torn garment to dry his eyes. From here, the masterful tonal shifts between tear-jerking melodrama and the uproarious physical comedy displayed in Chaplin's feature films, beginning with The Kid in 1921, are just a few artistic steps away. Once in Niles, California, Chaplin actually lived in Anderson's bungalow, which stood in the stark contrast to the fancy apartment in Chicago. It was drab, scarcely lit, barely furnished, and offered no working appliances. Quote, "The bathroom was unspeakable," unquote, Chaplin recalled. Quote, "One had to take a jug and fill it from the bath tap and empty it down the flush to make the toilet work. This was the home of G.M. Anderson, the multimillionaire cowboy," end quote. In fact, Anderson spent most nights in a suite at the St. Francis Hotel, commuting back to the Bay. Chaplin may have found that living in relative squalor was helpful to him, creatively. Years later, visitors were shocked to see his tiny dressing rooms. Quote, "If I had a room like Douglas Fairbanks Sr.'s dressing room, I couldn't possibly portray the little tramp," end quote. He said, quote, "I need a room that looks like him," end quote. Of course, that could have also simply been an excuse for his thriftiness. For his part, Chaplin, the rich young comedian, arrived in Niles, California, carrying nothing but a small handbag containing, quote, "a spare shirt, a few dingy changes of underwear, and a frayed toothbrush," end quote. Though the weather could only have been more agreeable, Chaplin was even less happy in the rustic Niles, California, where cows seemed to outnumber people, and none of the other bathrooms were any nicer than the one in Anderson's bungalow, than he had been in Chicago, where at least he felt as at home as a London boy would in another large city. Around the world, excuse me. Around the world, the motion picture business was changing. D.W. Griffith's 3-hour epic, The Birth of a Nation, which forever codified the language of movies, premiered exactly 1 week after his new job. Chaplin went to see it at least once a week and became seized with the notion that he too could make feature-length movies, applying the same language to comedy that Griffith did to drama. More and more creativity was being seen in the film world. Directors were now being regarded as artists, and movies had clearly turned a corner in the journey for short snippets of Fred Ott sneezing to modern epics that would characterize the golden age of Hollywood cinema. The opportunities for longer-form movies were almost nil at Essanay, however, where Spohr was still stuck in the old days. Much of Chaplin's post-his new job Essanay work was simply recycled from earlier material. The plots for his hastily made movies tended, wrote Joyce Milton, to start strongly and go nowhere. On the plus side, the pictures were made much more carefully, with less simple rough and tumble humor than his Keystone work, and the artistic isolation he had been able to make for himself allowed him to refine, even improve upon, the character of the tramp. Chaplin, the perfectionist, knew that he could make better movies. He also knew that Essanay was not the atmosphere in which he could do so, and that things were about to get worse. Already fearing that the smugness of being part of the old guard, lorded over by Edison and his patents, kept Spohr from caring much about quality, Chaplin resolved to go elsewhere. When 1915 drew to a close and his contract with Essanay was running out, Chaplin's star was clearly on the rise. His little tramp persona had made him one of the most recognizable faces in the world, and Chaplin knew that he was more than earning his large salary. He also knew that movies were changing, and that if he wanted to be a part of this growth and change, as he deserved to be, he would be better off at a studio that had not been made complacent by its membership in the Edison Trust. Even before he started with Keystone, Chaplin had known, he later said, that, quote, nothing transcends personality, end quote, in movies. Like Edison, his real victory was largely the result of his personality, not necessarily his considerable talent. There have been other silent comedians and directors who historians have held in higher esteem, such as Buster Keaton's movies today that are generally regarded as more modern, but it was Chaplin who was most successful at winning the hearts of audiences, just as Edison became the father of electricity despite his own actual accomplishments being overshadowed by those of Tesla. Essanay seems to have understood the value of Chaplin's personality. It was that studio that first credited him as Charlie, not Charles, to his chagrin. And it was Essanay that launched the marketing campaigns that infected the public with, quote, Chaplinitis, end quote, in 1915. Also, like Edison, Essanay failed to understand the importance of keeping hold of the top personalities in the field, even while understanding the value of personality. Just as Edison had lost W.K.L. Dixon to Biograph and all of his esteemed vocal talent to the Victor Talking Machine Company, Essanay too lost its own stars. Over the course of 1915, it had already lost Bushman to Metro, and Luella Parsons had left the studio to pioneer the gossip column for the Chicago Record-Herald around the same time Chaplin left the city. Ben Turpin, too, was now gone. He had left with Chaplin for Niles, but found that Chaplin was not about to let him steal any scenes, and he made only one movie there before relocating to Los Angeles. Even Gloria Swanson, with her mother, had moved away. He would soon land at Keystone, where he found the, quote, disreputable summer camp, end quote, atmosphere, and the improvised style of making movies delightful. Essanay, however, was not dead yet. George Spohr traveled to California to make Chaplin an offer for another year at a handsome raise. He was prepared to offer him $350,000 plus production expenses for 1 2-reel picture per month for the next year. That's incredible money if you think about that for today's standards here. Chaplin said, quote, on signing any contract, I want $150,000 bonus dollars plunked down first, end quote. I need to clear my throat a lot tonight. I don't know why. I'm not getting sick by any means. This offer meant that Chaplin would be earning $500,000 pay for the year, a huge increase over the previous year, not to mention the $700 per week he would have been earning in the second year of the contract Senate had offered. When Spohr balked, Chaplin made up his mind once and for all that he was through with Essanay. Chaplin dispatched his brother Sid to New York to field offers from other studios in January 1916. This time, there were plenty. Over the course of the year, Essanay's publicity machine had helped catapult Charlie to unheard-of stardom. Trinkets bearing his likeness were sold everywhere, though the honor of being the first to market Chaplin statues belonged to a Chicago man who sold them in catalogs. Stan Laurel, who had once been Chaplin's roommate in his vaudeville days, was still on the stage circuit, performing as a Chaplin impersonator. Chaplin knew that his movies were making tremendous amounts of money, but it seems that in his comparative isolation in California, he had no idea exactly how popular he had become across the country. When he boarded a slow train to New York to meet with his brother and negotiate offers with other companies, he still felt that no one would recognize him when he was not wearing his comedy makeup. After all, he had not even made the finals at a recent Charlie Chaplin lookalike contest in San Francisco. He was shocked when huge crowds gathered at every stop, even dragging him out of the car in his dressing gown to accept a key to the city of Amarillo, Texas, when the train stopped there. This kind of event, mobs waiting at every train stop in an age when the lack of airports and interstates made it impossible for stars to travel privately and in secret, would horrify a number of stars. It happened to her in 1925. Gloria Swanson would say that she felt like the half-dead whale that people had lined up to see when P.T. Barnum had moved it across the country in a seaweed-lined train car years before. At the end of 1914, only Molly Anderson had been present to greet Chaplin when he arrived in Chicago, despite the fact that he was traveling with her husband, the famous Bronco Billy. Now, barely more than a year later, when Chaplin's train pulled into Union Station, cheering crowds mobbed him as a waiting limousine took him to stay a night as a guest at the Blackstone Hotel. The Blackstone was an opulent palace right around the corner from the American Music Hall, where he had quietly made his Chicago debut less than 6 years earlier. Though he managed to avoid them in Chicago, Spohr and Anderson traveled to New York on board the 20th Century Limited, the same train Chaplin took, eager to renew the contract despite the earlier breakdown in negotiations. By this time, Essanay had lost nearly its entire stable of stars, and Spohr was not eager to lose his last great comedian. He was not far from losing his last great cowboy star and partner either. Spohr and Anderson were not on the best of terms by this time. Anderson, who Chaplin had found to be something of a charming eccentric, infuriated Spohr with his antics. Like Edison, Spohr simply did not seem to understand that movies were to be a business driven by creativity and talent, and that if he did not treat the most important talent like royalty, they would simply find a studio that would. Despite his being a partner in the business, Spohr does not seem to have treated Anderson very well at this time. Any attempt they made to retain Chaplin's services fell on deaf ears. Chaplin was eventually signed by the Mutual Film Corporation at a rate of $10,000 per week, plus the $150,000 bonus Spohr had refused to pay him. Many commentators and historians have since pointed to the loss of Chaplin as the single greatest mistake Essanay ever made. It would prove to be not just a nail in the company's coffin, but also a signal of the end of the days when Chicago was a major film center. None of the stars who left Essanay stayed in Chicago. They all headed for Los Angeles. Less than 2 months after Chaplin signed with Mutual, Spohr sent a cable to Niles announcing that the Niles studio was to be shut down. Only weeks later, Harper's Weekly became the first major publication to seriously put forth the proposition that Chaplin was no mere comedian, but a genius of the highest order. Nearly all of the actors had left by now. Swanson was gone before Essanay could make her into a star. Bushman was gone. Beery, for one, seemed to leave behind a trail of bad memories. More than 20 years later, when most of the backstage people from Selig and Essanay were working as stagehands in Chicago theaters, the Daily Tribune wrote that, quote, "The stagehands of Chicago, almost to a man, have very little to say in honor of Wallace Beery. They remember an experience they had with him when he was leaving Essanay in Argyle Street for the lush celluloid pastures of California. They determined to touch off a party in honor of his trek west. They took up a collection so that they could send a taxicab for Beery at his lodgings. He refused to ride in it, allegedly demanding a limousine. So he didn't show up at the party, and the stagehands have never forgotten it." End quote. Michael Figlulio, a stuntman, may be the only one who remembered him well, describing him in 1989 as, quote, "the kind of guy who would take in a stray dog or cat," end quote. Figlulio did, however, also note that Chaplin was, quote, "a real son of a bitch, cheap as hell," end quote. Essanay had lost most of its leading lights, most of the talent that could have kept them on top of the film world. The company and the Chicago film scene was hanging on to life by a thread. And that's the end of chapter 11. So next week's show will be on schedule. We will be starting part 4. It all came crashing down. And chapter 12, the decline of the Chicago studios. I apologize for my voice tonight. I usually do these in the mornings at 11 a.m. I did not start this until almost, like 9:20 p.m. at night. I had a very busy day. I had work that was scheduled earlier in the week, a gig that came up, and I had to take the opportunity. That's about it, though. You know what I think we could learn from today, from this chapter? Is that if you continue egging on people and prodding and poking them, such as Spoor did with Chaplin, they'll simply stop caring and they'll move on. They want to be in a place where they're appreciated. They want to be in a place where they're heard and listened to. And clearly Chaplin was not being listened to. There's people in this world that want to kill creativity. They want you to conform to whatever standards they think are high. But those same people's high standards are other people's low standards. And Chaplin just had enough. He made that decision early on. So the rest of this series is going to be dramatic from here on out. This is the end of the Chicago film industry. So we're going to see the collapse of it here. I don't enjoy reading this and doing this. I don't enjoy talking about the collapse of a certain film industry. And it's just how it is. We have to cover it, though. We have to cover it from the beginning to the end. And we're seeing how all these little things led up to it. You know, that whole thing with Spoor losing Chaplin that reminds me of some other things going on in current day in the media. But I don't want to jinx it. Be very careful with your words, because you might be speaking things into reality. So, that's all for today. I am feeling Chaplin's energy tonight for sure. But I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope you have a good week, good weekend, and tune in tomorrow. I got another Let's Talk going on. So until the next one, class dismissed.